Chapter 22 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Myra. I wrote the letter before I turned into bed, and gave instructions that it was to go by the first post in the morning, and that I was not to be disturbed. My exertions since catching sight of Felix Marazev talking with Dr. Murden at the gate of the Norwood villa that Sunday afternoon had, to say the least, been strenuous, and a night's rest would not come amiss. When I awoke, the sun was high and forcing its way into my bedroom through the slats of the blinds in little shafts of yellow light. I saw by my watch that it was 11 o'clock, and I rose and pulled up my blinds. It was a glorious day, and one that promised to be very hot. The sun blazed in the brazen blue of the sky, and the hotels opposite lay white under the glare, their windows gay with red-striped sun-blinds and radiant blossoms. There was a boy racing along crying out his papers, and I rang the bell and sent out for one. The Park Lane affair having taken place on a Sunday, the evening papers had put on pressure and evidently rushed their first editions this morning. I put on a dressing-gown and pulled my chair up to the open window. When the servant had placed my tea and toast to my hand and had left the room, I reached eagerly for the paper. It was an early Star, and beyond giving its own account of the happenings in the West End, it gave, what was far more interesting to me, extracts from the morning press on the same subject. Just as I had expected, the Mercury was the only paper except one which had touched to any extent upon the anarchist aspect of the burglary in Park Lane. The other report I refer to commented upon the nationality of the dead ruffian, and deduced that the affair was the work of a continental gang, and they had many bitter things to say as to the question of admitting alien criminals into England. But at the end of the article in question my heart seemed to stand still as I read. The writer had finished. At the moment of going to press, a report has been sent by our Plymouth correspondent that a daring escape was effected early on Sunday evening from the Dartmoor prison, the man who had regained his liberty being none other than Paul Bergstoff, whose connection with the Azov diamond was the cause of his 5 years' sentence. Whether this is a strange coincidence, or whether the superstition that such historic gems as the Azov have influence over the lives and destinies remains to— The paper dropped from my listless fingers, and I sat there gazing with unseeing eyes over the trees in the square below me. All the airy castles of my hopes seemed to crumble, and my world darkened as I thought of all that this news meant to me. Perhaps it was only a rumour. Paul Bergstoff was dead. Dead. I had seen it in print. There could be no mistake. But had I not been rather quick to take the evidence of the scrap of printing in the cutting book the rat had shown me in Moscow? I grew chill with the knowledge of my own evil heart when I asked myself whether I had not been only too glad to believe that the man who had trusted me was dead. I took up the paper again. Coincidence! I laughed bitterly. What of the other coincidence that Paul should regain his freedom at the moment that I had located Myra? I have looked at the door of my room as though I expected it would open to admit a tattered figure, with clothes black-arrowed and stained, who would come to me and demand an account of my stewardship. The paper had turned as it fell from my hands, and showed the page containing that day's news. Of course I would find here confirmation, or— I turned the sheet feverishly. There was no mention— Yes. Below me a barrel organ was playing a popular waltz, and all the merry music of the streets came up to me as I read that which brought all my dreams tumbling about my ears. I read that up to a late hour last night the warders had been unable to gain any clue as to the whereabouts of the convict Bergstoff, who had made good his escape earlier in the evening. The report went on to say that the man, of whom a complete description was given, had had a start of a little over an hour before his escape was discovered, and that a mist which had descended over the moor had greatly hampered the movements of the officials. There was another report below, marked "Later." The body of a man had been discovered on a lonely part of the road which runs between the two railway lines that connect Tavistock with Marytavy. There were marks of a scuffle, and a patch of oil in the road seemed to point to the presence of a motor-car. The dead man, from whom the clothes had been stripped, lay in a ditch and had been dead some 4 hours. The report went on to say, "There can be little doubt that this man, when his identity is traced, will be found to have been a chauffeur, and that the escaped convict, by some ruse which will perhaps never be known, attacked and overpowered him on the lonely road." And so, I said to myself, Paul Bergstoff was a murderer, and in this I thought I saw an outlet for my dilemma. I did not know how matters stood between Bergstoff and Myra. The girl, during the little while I had been with her, had not even mentioned his name. Did my duty lie now in preventing the man from meeting her? How could I let any perverted sense of my duty to Paul Bergstoff help in tying for life a sweet girl like Myra to a murderer and an escaped convict? I lunched alone in my hotel, a prey to the most conflicting emotions. I spent a great deal of my time in writing a full report of the evidence I had got together, dealing with the treachery of Felix Marazof. It was my intention to leave this in the possession of Myra, if she were willing, so that if in the coming fight with the man with the red beard I were worsted, proof of his villainy would still be in existence. There was a further report in the later papers, and from this it seemed that what had appeared such a coincidence was not so great a one at all. The prison clothes of Paul Bergstoff had been found hidden beneath a heap of stones on a tor not a mile from the prison. This seemed to point to the fact that the man had known where to make for on his escape, and that where the prison clothes were found others had been in readiness for him, placed there by some unknown friend. A hotel-keeper in Tavistock had informed the police that 2 foreign gentlemen stayed at his house last week for a few days, and from this description these would seem to have been Russians, or in any event natives of Eastern Europe. These descriptions, however, fitted none of the men with whom my wanderings had brought me in touch. I made an early dinner at a restaurant in the Tottenham Court Road, and then took an omnibus to Highgate, choosing to walk to my rendezvous by way of the Spaniards' Lane. The promise of the morning had been amply fulfilled, and the day was dying in a riot of colour. As I passed the Spaniards and emerged on to the expanse of the heath, I thought that the scene would be difficult to beat in any part of the world. It was magnificent. A clump of twisted firs stood out black against the sky, a sky ablaze in the west with rose and saffron and glory. The ridge-like roadway which runs across the gorse-strewn heath was still fairly thickly peopled, and the seats lining it, and dotted here and there among the firs, were mostly occupied. I rather wished that I had arranged my meeting with Myra at a less conspicuous spot. To the right of me the broken, shrub-dotted ground rolled away into the haze of the coming night. A little below me a few lights flickered uncertainly, and somewhere among them, I said, was Myra Ramsay, and somewhere there, as I turned to my left, among the jungle of bricks and mortar spreading out like a great purple cloud, was Felix Marazof. Paul Bergstoff, too, would be there, for he would make for the metropolis, I told myself, in all haste, if he had been successful in shaking off the hue and cry against him. It was very quiet now on the darkening highway. From the city there seemed to come the elusive murmur of its striving millions. Just below me at the Vale of Health a steam organ was wheezing out an old melody, and from time to time a shout of raucous laughter would jar on the beauty of the evening. I looked at my watch, and saw that I was still some quarter of an hour ahead of my time. I was glad of this, as it meant that it would be practically dark when I should see Myra, and I was not desirous of advertising our meeting more than was absolutely necessary. I walked back the way I had come, as far as the Spaniards, where, in a little arbour in its gardens, I drank a brandy and soda. As I took in the surroundings of the famous old tavern with its Dick Turpin associations, I raised my glass to the memory of the highwayman and his gallant Black Bess. After all, I told myself with a smile, there was nothing so very new in expropriation. Walking back, I reached the horse-pond as the clocks down in Hampstead were chiming the hour. I stood by the railings where I could watch the road, and wondered what reception I was about to receive. Myra was only a few minutes behind her time, and my heart beat wildly as I saw the well-loved figure ascending the pathway. The girl came to a halt at the bend, and stood there silhouetted against the topaz of the sky. I imagined that there was a certain timidity in her attitude and manner, and, anxious to put her at her ease as soon as possible, I strolled towards her, whistling as I did so a tune that I had heard in Moscow, one which was much in vogue amongst the revolutionaries. As I came to her she turned her head with a nervous look of inquiry, and on my raising my hat she held out her hand and fell into step beside me. We might have been just one of the many pairs of lovers who met at that spot every evening. Myra spoke after we had taken a few steps in silence. "You wrote me that you can tell me of one who is dead?" I turned to her, We were passing under a gas lamp as she spoke, and I could hardly repress a start at the change that had come over my poor girl. Terror, hopeless dragging weariness had drawn the roses from her cheeks and given to the eyes the look of one haunted by a great dread. There was no need for me to prolong the deception. "You do not know me, Myra." It seemed quite natural that I should call her that. She gave a little cry, and would, I think, have fallen, but I was ready for any effect my words would have. I thought she was going to faint as she had done on that other occasion when we were together in Moscow, but she recovered herself and stood upright, one hand resting against the trunk of a tree. "Mr. Mannering is dead," she said. "Mr. Mannering is nothing of the kind," I answered, and the little laugh with which I accompanied my rather flippant remark seemed to break the tension, for Myra bent forward with a glad little cry. "But, oh, I see now, it is you! Thank God for it! Then he was wrong. He said he saw you shot. He sent me this." "Who?" I asked. She pulled at the collar of her blouse and drew out a slender gold chain, and at the end I saw in the lamplight dangled a little silver pig, a tiny mascot engraved with my initials that had been given me by Winson when we bought the Mercury, and which I had worn for years. Together with all my effects, the little trinket had vanished after I had been sentenced in the room in the Moscow prison. But I did not look long at the petit cochon. Beyond it shone the grey eyes I had hungered so long for. There was no terror now, and in their depths I read the message I had read once before across the frozen snows of the cul-de-sac. There was no mistake this time, and there was no need for words. I just opened my arms, and Myra crept between them with a happy little sigh. No doubt the passers-by, if there were any, said to themselves that a cook had come out to meet with her milkman lover, and on their reaching home would say that they didn't know what Hampstead was coming to. We stood there, beneath the shadow of a great tree, heart to heart for a few moments. What I said to her as I bent my head o'er hers, outpourings of a love-starved soul, I do not know, but in a little while we were again walking along the road, telling the same old story that those trees had listened to since they had been saplings, and which, please God, they will go on hearing till the end of time. Myra told me of how love had come to her as we knelt in the snow watching the soldiers bring in their dead, of how she had moved heaven and earth to gain news of my fate. Her own release had been quick. Some influence, she thought, must have been at work, for 2 or 3 others, including Marazeff, had been freed also. Marazeff. I clenched my teeth as I heard the hated name, but in Myra's voice there was no hatred. She told me of the efforts he had made to discover me and use any influence he possessed for my release. He had searched every corner of Moscow, only to come to her a few weeks later, by which time I was in Azanov's hands, with the news that he had heard that I had been included in a batch of revolutionaries who had that morning met their death at the hands of a firing party in a Moscow prison. The little silver pig he had obtained from a warder of his acquaintance who had shown him my body. "Felix Marazeff was mistaken," I said shortly, when Myra had finished her recital. For the moment I kept the knowledge of his villainy to myself. End of chapter 22.